A charming and spirited young mother.
Oh, she was so vivacious, like a little firecracker. She was sweet and loving, but she just didn't take any crap off anybody.
Is found strangled in her bedroom.
Whoever did this left her there with no chance to survive.
Police face a challenging crime scene.
There was no forensic evidence whatsoever. No fingerprints. No eyewitnesses.
This case was a definite whodunit case.
And a long list of suspects.
He had been hanging around her desk, and he had made some comments that really creeped her out.
She had had some troubled boyfriends in the past.
He didn't want to accept the fact that they were done. Their relationship was over.
You would think that whoever did it had a score to settle.
Until one big break reveals a culprit.
That one key piece of evidence was the aha moment in the case.
And it shocks everyone.
When they finally discovered who it was just surreal.
There's no rhyme, there's no reason behind it. It was absolutely senseless.
Just before 5 p.m. on a Monday in March of 1999, in the small bedroom community of Norcross, Georgia, police raced through the suburban streets in response to a 911 call.
The only information that we had at hand initially was there had been a person discovered dead in an apartment. It was her fiance that had called 911. When we arrived at the scene, we spoke with the fiance briefly.
The man tells detectives the victim is 20-year-old mother of one, Danielle Jennings. Her 2-year-old son is currently at daycare.
The fiance told us he walked in and found her lying on the bed, and he stated that she was cold and blue.
She was deceased by that point. She was face down on the bed, and he rolled her over and then called 911.
While Danielle's fiance is taken to provide a statement, investigators take a close look at the crime scene.
When you went back into the bedroom, she was on the bed, fully clothed, laying on her back, but you could obviously see signs of strangulation.
She had a ligature around her neck. The ligature appeared to be some type of stocking, and it was tied around her neck very, very tight.
It had been tied off to leave it that way. It's not like it released, which I thought was pretty unusual. I mean, whoever did this left her there with no chance to survive.
The ligature was knotted in the back, which would tell you that the person was on her back, behind her, when she was strangled.
Detectives explore the rest of the crime scene, looking for clues.
The bed was messed up. One of the dresser drawers was open. The stocking that she was strangled with may have been one of hers out of that drawer. Her purse was dumped out as if somebody had dumped the contents and rummaged through it. It could have been a robbery or a burglary just gone wrong. However, there was other stuff such as cameras, miscellaneous jewelry that could have been taken, but they were not taken.
It was possibly a burglary that had been interrupted, but you always have to consider the possibility that it could have been a staged burglary because, frankly, there really wasn't a lot of disruption.
Next, investigators try to determine how the killer entered the apartment.
There was absolutely no tool marks or anything on the front door, and then there was a sliding patio glass door. It was locked. There was no evidence of tampering with it at all. We went around and we searched the outside, but we didn't turn up anything of any value.
Before they return to the station to interview Danielle's fiance, detectives fan out to speak with other tenants in the complex.
Most of the people in these complexes work during the day, and so most of them are not home. We left our business cards with a note asking them to please give us a call.
As the crime scene investigation continues, news of Danielle's violent murder quickly spreads to her family and friends.
When I found out that Danielle died, I said, no, you've got to be kidding me. I said, this cannot be real. And then I dropped the phone and I just started screaming. I was just absolutely in utter shock. How does one handle the information that your best friend, your sister, the person that you basically love more than anybody in this world is gone? Why would somebody do this to such a loving, caring, beautiful person?
Born in Columbia, South Carolina in 1978, Danielle grew up with her mother and stepfather in Stockton, Georgia. Even in her youth, Danielle had a magnetic personality.
She was beautiful, strong, tenacious, ferocious. She was very fun. Danielle was always ready to have a good time, to laugh.
Oh, she was so vivacious, like a little firecracker. She was very tiny, but she had this big attitude. She was sweet and loving, but she just didn't take any crap off anybody.
Danielle showed her resilience when she was left to deal with an unplanned pregnancy alone at the age of 16.
There was never a doubt in her mind that she wanted to have that baby. She wasn't scared. I mean, she had brass balls of steel.
She wasn't going to let her age stand in the way of being a good mother.
Danielle gave birth to her son, Tristan, in 1996.
She was so proud. I could see her little attitude in him.
The new mother longed for her son to have a father and hoped she had found one when she started dating Luis Payano.
We grew up with Louis, so we go way back with him. We met Louis in our early teen years. Danielle was always partial to Louis, and Louis and Danielle were dating, and I was so thrilled. And the way that Louis would look at Danielle, like she would walk into the room and he would just light up.
Soon, the couple moved into an apartment together, and Danielle landed an office job at a landscaping company.
She was so excited to have like what we titled a big girl job. She was very proud of herself. We were all very proud of her, you know? She was going places.
In December of 1998, Luis asked Danielle to marry him.
She was so excited, and I'm like, this is going to be the best marriage ever. When Danielle first got her engagement ring, it was too big. And I said, girl, you got to get it sized. She's like, I don't want to take it off. It was beautiful.
Danielle had everything going for her. She had a great career opportunity ahead of her. She had a man she was so excited to marry. She had a beautiful son that just meant the world to her. Danielle was really on top of her game.
She was probably the happiest I had ever seen her.
Now, all Danielle's happiness and hope has been stolen by a cold-blooded killer.
I could not even begin to fathom why somebody would do that to her.
Back at the crime scene, investigators are searching for answers.
The scene raised several questions. Of course, the most obvious was, how did whoever it was get into the apartment? Because there was no sign of forced entry. Was it someone she knew? We know, working off the percentages, that the person most likely to kill you is laying next to you in the bed. In this case, Danielle's fiancé, Luis.
Coming up, detectives unearth dark secrets.
She had had some troubled boyfriends in the past.
He was violent. He was abusive. You could tell when he talked about Danielle that it made him mad.
He was just very, very creepy to me. And I know they had tumultuous fights.
The person that did it could have been amongst us.
And just as the case threatens to turn cold,
We felt like we had hit a brick wall.
I had a huge fear that whoever it was got away with it.
a stunning revelation points to a killer no one suspected.
The killer was much closer to home than anybody first thought. I don't think anybody saw it coming.
police investigating the murder of 20-year-old mother Danielle Jennings have their first suspect, her fiancé, 25-year-old Luis Payano.
Even though he's her fiancé, everybody remains a suspect until such time that we solve the crime.
Investigators question the distraught young man.
He was very emotional, but romance can raise anger to a level sometimes that leads to homicide.
Detectives begin their interview by asking Luis about Danielle's movements the day of her murder.
He stated that he had been at work all day. The last time he had seen Danielle was when he left to go to work.
According to Luis, they had both left the apartment at 6:45 a.m., but Danielle went back into the building to get something. He tells detectives that Danielle seemed distracted because of an upcoming work meeting.
She was supposed to be having a meeting with management that day. She didn't feel easy about it.
Luis says Danielle called him at work around 11:30 a.m.
She wanted to see if Luis would have lunch with her, but he was tied up at work and he couldn't break free.
They didn't have lunch, and later in the afternoon, he couldn't reach her.
He called her at work, and then they told him that she had gone home at lunchtime, but she didn't come back from lunch after a couple of hours.
Luis tells investigators he called Danielle's cell phone and their apartment.
He stated that he was trying to get hold of Danielle and was not getting a response, and then he left work and went home to see if she was there.
Luis said that when he got home, the front door was unlocked, and that really surprised him because they were pretty careful about keeping the front door locked.
Detectives ask Luis about his relationship with Danielle.
We wanted to find out if they had domestic issues. He said that it was a very good relationship and they were very much in love with each other.
To verify his story, detectives call Luis's work and Danielle's loved ones.
Her family and friends stated that they were just a young couple that were very much in love and looking forward to getting married and spending their life together.
She had had some troubled boyfriends in the past, but Luis was on the up and up. I mean, he was setting up a financially stable life for him and Danielle and Tristan, and she loved him so much.
Danielle's friends are adamant that Luis would never harm her, and his alibi seems solid.
We were able to confirm that he had been at work all day through statements of his coworkers. As a result, he was eliminated as a suspect. Now you're on the hunt for other suspects.
With Luis in the clear, detectives ask him if he knew of anyone who may want to harm Danielle.
He brought up the name of Jeff, a co-worker of Danielle. She had filed a sexual harassment complaint against him at work. That piqued our interest a little bit. We immediately went to Danielle's place of work and we met with her supervisor and discussed what was going on.
Danielle's supervisor tells detectives about the young mother's harassment complaint against her coworker.
He was a middle-aged man. He worked at the same landscape company. He had a different job. He was in management. Danielle told her manager and supervisor he had been hanging around her desk and he had made some comments that really kind of creeped her out and acting inappropriately at work.
There was a big age difference between Danielle and Jeff. He was 40, she was 20. He had asked her out for lunch, and she told him that she had a fiancé that she loved, and he had made a comment to her that if he was 20 years younger, things would be a lot different.
Danielle had briefly touched base with me about the situation that she was having at work. Dude was kind of crushing on her, and she was trying to get that, under control. But I said, just don't let it get out of hand.
She filed the complaint. I kind of admired her grit. She wasn't going to take it. The company was very responsive to her complaint. They took it seriously. They moved quickly.
Detectives note the timing when told of the company's response.
That day that Danielle was killed, she was supposed to be having a meeting with upper management about the sexual harassment charge.
Once we realized that the meeting had taken place that day, that was something that was suspicious.
Talking with the management, we found out Danielle was anxious and nervous about the meeting.
She was a relatively new employee when she made the complaint. That was one of the reasons she was so nervous, because his career was in a certain amount of jeopardy.
Coworkers state that after the meeting, Danielle went home for lunch, but never returned.
She didn't come back, and we knew that was consistent with the time of death. You had to think, where was the coworker at the time?
Detective suspicions increase when they learn that Jeff was out of the office and did not return until late in the day. Was this too much of a coincidence? Could he have killed Danielle as revenge for her complaint?
We definitely wanted to speak with him face to face.
Detectives hunting the killer of Danielle Jennings suspect a harassment complaint against her coworker, Jeff, may have led to retaliation and murder.
We were now focused on him as a possible suspect. We had to consider the possibility that he followed her home and ambushed her and killed her.
Investigators bring the 40-year-old in for an interview and ask about his interaction with 20-year-old Danielle.
He admitted to asking her out for lunch, but he said other than that, he had not done anything.
He talked about the sexual harassment complaint and pretty typically said, I didn't think it was that big a deal. I didn't know she was that offended.
According to police reports, Jeff denies any sexual intentions toward Danielle.
He told police that whatever lapse in manners that he had had with Danielle, that he liked her. He seemed to be genuinely dismayed to find out what had happened.
Detectives ask if Danielle's complaint gave him a reason to want to harm her.
His first reaction was he was angry. He was adamant that he was not a suspect. And then he said it couldn't have been me because my truck was broken and I was on a job with somebody else, with a coworker, and I can prove it.
Jeff provides investigators with the name of the coworker he claims to have been with.
We immediately ran down his coworker at like 1 o'clock in the morning. This guy verified that he was with him all day till the close of business, that they were together.
With his alibi confirmed, police eliminate Jeff as a suspect. 24 hours after Danielle's murder, the enormity of her death is only just starting to hit home for Danielle's loved ones.
Things like that didn't happen where we grew up. I could not believe somebody would do that to her. It was just the most nightmarish thing I could imagine. It made me question God. Why would you let something that horrible happen to her?
I didn't want to accept it. I couldn't sleep. I just kept saying, she's dead, she's dead. Danielle should not be dead.
The following day, investigators receive the autopsy report and scour it for anything that might point to Danielle's killer.
The manner of death was asphyxiation or strangulation.
The medical examiner stated that she probably lost consciousness within about 15 to 20 seconds after the ligature was placed around her neck.
It seemed clear that she had been surprised by her attacker, had no time to move, had no time to strike back.
It's almost like it came out of nowhere. We knew from the positioning of the knot, someone had come up behind her with the nylon stocking, pulled it tight until she lost consciousness, and then tied it off to kill her. She had not been sexually assaulted. There weren't any other injuries. There weren't any defensive injuries.
This case was a definite whodunit case. There was no evidence found at the scene that could help us.
There was no forensic evidence whatsoever. No transfer of skin, no fingerprints, nothing a lab could look at.
After striking out with the autopsy, investigators revisit the theory that the homicide was a robbery gone wrong.
We don't live there, so we don't know what's supposed to be there and what's not. We asked the fiance to go back through the apartment with us and tell us what he sees missing. The smallest detail sometimes helps point us into the direction of a suspect, but nothing was missing according to the fiance. At that point, we had absolutely nothing to go on, other than the stocking that she was strangled with.
Detectives ask Luis if he recognizes the stocking.
We wanted to know whether it came from her. It was a tan, knee-high women's stocking, and he said that she never wore anything like that, and we didn't find any in the apartment. Whoever did this brought that with them.
The homicide was brutal, violent, and vicious. It lent itself to a personal motive. You would think that whoever did it had a score to settle.
Louise told us she had had some tumultuous relationships in her past, so we pursued that angle.
Investigators asked Danielle's friends about her previous relationships.
When they first started questioning me, they were asking me a lot of questions about her boyfriends in the past, who I felt might have been able to do it. And then it clicked that, Eddie, he was a tow truck driver, and he was a big guy. And he was just very, very creepy to me.
Her best friend told us about her ex-boyfriend. He was violent. He was abusive.
She ended up having to get a restraining order on him. With Eddie, no one ever really knew when he was going to pop up again.
That was somebody we needed to look at.
Two days after the murder of 20-year-old Danielle Jennings, friends have alerted investigators to Eddie McElwaney, an ex-boyfriend with a violent history.
We learned a lot about her former boyfriend. We learned that she had begun to see him when she was a teenager, when she was younger.
Friends reveal Danielle started dating Eddie shortly after she became pregnant from another relationship. But Eddie's behavior soon raised red flags.
As they got more serious, he became more possessive and controlling, and he definitely wanted to start isolating her from her friends and family more.
I didn't want to be around him. I did not like the way he made me feel. I didn't like the way he looked at Danielle. I mean, he would sometimes look at her with disgust. And I know they had tumultuous fights.
We learned it had been an abusive relationship, physical and emotional.
I mean, she would stand up to anybody, but as tough and as a badass as she was, I think she was a little bit afraid of him.
Things only got worse with Eddie when Danielle gave birth to her child.
Her family and friends stated that shortly after her son was born, Eddie was getting involved in drugs, and that was finally the straw that broke the camel's back, and she ended the relationship with that.
Danielle moved out and tried to start fresh, but Eddie had other plans.
She knew it was going to be difficult, but she didn't realize that Eddie was not going to leave Danielle in peace. He didn't want to accept the fact that they were done, their relationship was over. She never knew when he would turn up around the corner, when she just wanted to be left alone.
She had gotten a restraining order against Eddie because he had been stalking her. He had been driving back and forth in front of her house. He had gone to her work, and she was in fear that she was in danger.
We found out that he had violated the restraining order several times. He would call her, leave voicemails for her. He would drive by her house several times a day or night.
When police ask when Eddie last contacted Danielle, the answer is troubling.
Danielle's family had told us that within the last few months he had been calling her, trying to get her to talk to him, but she would just hang up on him.
Could Eddie have shown up at Danielle's apartment the day she was killed, leading to a deadly confrontation?
I've seen a lot of domestic abuse cases, so I knew that there was a possibility that with his past that he could have done something like that.
Investigators track down Eddie and bring him in for questioning.
In the interview with Eddie, he was kind of belligerent and unhappy to be there and a little bit hostile. You could tell when he talked about Danielle that it made him mad. What we saw with Eddie certainly had all the earmarks of a domestic violence case.
When questioned about his relationship with Danielle, Eddie's responses raised detectives' suspicions even more.
When he was asked about the relationship, his version was a little bit different. He never mentioned any abuse. He thought everything was great.
We asked him when was the last time that he had had any contact with Danielle, and he said that he had not talked to her for at least a year or longer. We know that he's lying about that. From speaking with Danielle's family and friends, we knew in the last several months he had been calling her.
At that point, he's looking pretty good. So you have to determine where he was at the time of the crime.
Eddie tells detectives that he was working many miles away from where Danielle was killed.
He said that on his job as a tow truck driver that he had to go out of state.
Investigators immediately look into Eddie's alibi.
His boss verified that he was out of state and he was able to produce hotel receipts, gas receipts that showed that he was actually out of state at the time of the crime.
Whenever he responded to a legitimate call, he had to log it, and his whereabouts could be verified throughout the day.
That is a pretty tight alibi, so he was eliminated as a suspect.
It's another dead end for detectives.
Once again, we're knocked for a loop and we're back to ground zero, and he moves down the line and we're looking for somebody else.
It was infuriating. It was frustrating. I had a huge fear that whoever it was got away with it, because people get away with murder every day. I was really hoping that the detectives would find something, because you're sitting here trying to point a finger at somebody that you don't know who.
There was this air of suspense around everything because we didn't know at that time who had killed Danielle. The person that did it could have been amongst us.
We had basically eliminated everybody who was close to the victim. When you get to that point of an investigation, you don't have anywhere else to logically follow up.
With no more leads, the investigation is at a standstill.
We felt like we had hit a brick wall, and then we got a call that changed everything.
Three days after finding Danielle Jennings strangled in her apartment bedroom, police hunting her killer have just got a stunning new lead.
We received a phone call from a Miss Kirk that resided at the apartment complex.
The woman tells detectives about a disturbing incident that took place a week before Danielle was killed.
She was awakened one morning by someone knocking at the door, and she looked out the peephole but didn't see anybody there, so she went back to bed. And a few minutes later, she hears the front door open, and the maintenance man is standing there. The maintenance man says that he's there for a work order. However, Miss Kirk says she felt very uncomfortable the entire time that he was in there because he was always staring at her, like he was more preoccupied with her than he was completing the work order.
The woman cannot provide the name of the maintenance man, but she gives a description to police. Detectives head back to Danielle's apartment complex to investigate.
While speaking with the management at the complex, we found that there was another case similar in the past from a Miss Bruno that lived in the apartment complex.
Management told the detectives that someone had walked into this woman's apartment She had, of course, asked him who the heck he was. What are you doing in my apartment? And he said maintenance, and claimed that he was there to change light bulbs. And she said, I don't have any light bulbs to change. He kind of mumbled and stumbled, and then, maybe I have the wrong apartment, and he backed out and left. It was so similar to the other one, which of course raises our eyebrows.
The complex was big enough so that there were several maintenance workers, but only one closely fit the description given by the young ladies. That would be Calvin Oliver.
We showed a photograph of Mr. Oliver to Miss Bruno and Miss Kurt, and both of them identified him as the person that had walked in on them.
Investigators discover a disturbing trend emerged after Calvin had been hired 7 months ago.
Come to find out, there had been several burglaries reported where items had been stolen out of apartments that had no forced entry.
Could Calvin have been responsible for these thefts?
We learned that he had an apartment in the complex. The fact that he lives there makes it so accessible that he could walk around, not be suspicious. We also learned that the custodians had access to the master keys of every apartment. He has complete access.
Detectives search for any link between Danielle and Calvin.
We found out that he had done a work order in her apartment a couple of weeks prior to the murder.
That is somebody that you really want to look at. It went back to our original theory of if this was a burglary, then it had been interrupted. He could have known that Danielle Jennings was gone during the daytime, and he decided that day that he was going to enter that apartment.
Investigators haul Calvin Oliver in for an interview, but make the call to slow play their suspicions.
When Oliver was brought in for questioning, we didn't want to tip him off to anything about the homicide. So he was interviewed initially about the burglaries. He absolutely denied any of that. He said, I didn't steal anything, I didn't go into apartments. He denied any involvement in any burglaries.
The 42-year-old tells detectives that his intrusion on the two women in the complex was a simple misunderstanding.
Once we got around to interviewing him about the murder, the first question was, did you hear about this? It was kind of odd. You would have thought that a person who worked in that apartment complex and was there every day would have heard everything about it. He went, yeah, I think I heard something about it. I don't know much about it. I don't know that woman.
He insisted he knew nothing about, as he described her, that dead girl.
All he admitted to knowing her was that he had done the work order in her apartment.
At that point, we had a pattern of conduct going into apartments. We had the admission that he had been in the apartment, but we had nothing that directly linked him to the murder.
With nothing concrete on Calvin, detectives end the interview. But before they let him walk free, police run a background check and are shocked by what they find.
He had a criminal history of burglary and theft. There was an outstanding warrant on him for failure to appear on a burglary charge in another jurisdiction. That day that Danielle was killed, if he's in there and she walks in on him, that would be a reason for him to cause her harm because he doesn't want to go back to prison.
He had an outstanding warrant, so he was held for that, and that bought them enough time while they investigated.
Based on the burglaries that had occurred in the complex, we obtained a search warrant for his apartment. We're trying to see if we can find anything that would tie him to Danielle Jennings. We're looking for any type of the stockings or pantyhose or anything that would be similar to the one that we found tied around her neck.
Detectives find no matching stocking, but they do discover incriminating evidence.
We do find evidence of the other burglaries that had been committed in the complex. And then we also found out that he had possession of a master key for the apartment complex so that he could open any door on any building at any time and he was not supposed to be in possession of that key.
It's only enough evidence to allow investigators to charge Calvin with burglary.
We concluded that search with those items, but nothing was found relevant to the murder. You really don't have anywhere else to go at that point.
We don't have a stocking, we don't have anything that ties him to Danielle or her apartment at all.
That's where we were until Luis called. Out of the blue, he said, "Do you have the engagement ring?"
We told him, no, we don't have a ring, we didn't know one was missing. And then he describes the ring, and then the big bright light goes off. When we were doing the search on Oliver's apartment, we noticed a ring on a dresser in his bedroom, but the ring didn't match any of the items stolen, so we really didn't have a reason to seize it at that time. We do another search warrant, go back into the apartment, we seize that ring, we show it to the fiance. He can't positively identify the ring, but he says her best friend will definitely be able to identify it. If we were able to identify that as being Danielle's ring, that would physically tie Oliver to Danielle and her apartment on the day that she was murdered.
With the entire investigation on the line, detectives race to the home of Danielle's best friend.
Is that ring the engagement ring? This is something we gotta know.
Investigators believe the key to solving the murder of Danielle Jennings is her missing engagement ring.
If we had that ring, then we had the killer.
Detectives have seized a ring from suspect Calvin Oliver's apartment. But is it Danielle's engagement ring? They hope her best friend can answer that question.
The detective and Lewis were there, and I said, well, what's going on? And the detective looked at me and he said, Leslie, he said, do you know what Danielle's engagement ring looked like? And I said, yes, sir, I do. The detective said, is there any defining characteristics to this ring? He goes, and I need you to be specific. And I said, yes, sir. I said it was bent. She had bent the band so it stayed snug on her finger because she wouldn't take the dang thing to get sized.
We needed to find out when was the last time she had seen her wearing the ring.
I said, I saw Danielle the Sunday before she was killed, and she had her ring on Sunday night. And he takes the evidence bag out and he says, is this her ring? And the minute I saw it, I knew it was hers.
When we had that ring and had it identified as being hers, we knew that we had the guy. We knew we had the right person.
Finding the ring was the aha moment in the case. And that was the piece of evidence that allowed us to charge Calvin Oliver with murder.
9 days after her death, Calvin Oliver is arrested for the murder of Danielle Jennings.
The primary charge was malice murder, and that means that you intentionally and unlawfully kill another human being.
Detectives once again interview Calvin, this time taking a different approach.
Once you have a suspect under arrest for the charge that you're interviewing him about, then the interview becomes very direct. He was given a chance again to tell the story where he denied any involvement in the murder, and then he was confronted with the evidence that we had.
We told him about the ring, and that's when he said, well, I stole that ring 2 weeks ago when I did the work order in her apartment. But see, we knew that was a lie because we had people that had seen her wearing the ring, so we knew that he was lying about that.
Calvin refuses to answer any more questions.
We told him that he was being charged with malice murder because you took the pantyhose with you into the apartment because you had intent to harm someone, and he said there was no intent there, which was a good comment to have in a statement. It's like he admitted to killing her without knowing that he had admitted to it. We were convinced 100% that we had our guy. This is the guy that was responsible for the death of Danielle Jennings, and that we were going to send him to prison for the rest of his life.
News of an arrest in Danielle's murder brings relief to her loved ones and surprise.
When they finally discovered who it was, the maintenance man in her apartment building, it was just surreal.
I don't think anybody saw it coming. The killer was much closer to home than anybody first thought.
When I saw his picture, I threw up, knowing that was the man that strangled my best friend for no reason.
At trial, prosecutors present how they believe the crime unfolded.
The day Danielle was killed, Mr. Oliver had already let himself in, hoping for financial gain. After the HR meeting about her coworker, Danielle went home for lunch by herself. Once she opened the door and stepped in, he knew she was there, and he knew she could not exit again. He was not going to get caught.
He ambushed her from behind with the stocking. He came over her head. He pulled it tight, pushed her down onto the bed until she lost consciousness, and then he tied the ligature off, and there was no way for her to escape. There was no heat of the moment. There was no emotion. He killed Danielle because it made his life easier.
The jury hears about the prosecution's most damning evidence, Danielle's stolen engagement ring.
I had to be the one to testify about the ring because I identified the ring. I actually had to look at that man. I had to sit there and look at him. Calvin Oliver sat there just staring daggers into me, is what he did, and tried everything he could to make me feel uncomfortable. And I took a big, deep breath, and I stared right back at him.
There was no explanation for the presence of this ring in Calvin Oliver's apartment, other than he took it off Danielle Jennings' dead finger.
On October 13th, 2000, after a 5-day trial, the jury delivers their verdict.
He was found guilty on all charges.
The judge sentences Calvin Oliver to life in prison.
When the verdict came through, we were all holding hands. We just knew justice had been served as far as it could be. I mean, we were glad, but it still wasn't going to bring her back. Her mom was never the same again. It destroyed her. That horrible man took away an angel that was put here. She was a huge light to me, to her fiance, to her son. She was everything to a lot of people. To this day, I still dream of her. There's not a day that goes by that I don't miss her.
An ambitious, popular young restaurant manager
She was a tremendous young person who had unlimited potential. We always thought she'd just light the world on fire.
is found beaten, stabbed, and suffocated.
The person who did this absolutely wanted to guarantee that she was dead.
Whoever did it ransacked the safe. Something that brutal had to be more than just a robbery.
Detectives uncover a history of workplace conflict.
She didn't like to be told what to do.
He scared me. I was uncomfortable around him. For me, that was a red flag.
With the community on edge, another attack leaves them living in fear.
It was such a similar homicide, a lone female employee and the use of a knife.
You don't know if somebody's lurking out there and they're going to do it again.
And new evidence confirms disturbing suspicions.
The lab informed me that there was a match.
I just couldn't believe what was happening. Like, when am I going to wake up?
Terry's murder wasn't what it appeared to be.
Falls Township, Pennsylvania is a family-friendly suburb with blue-collar roots.
Falls Township is a community in Lower Bucks County, Pennsylvania. It was built up around the U.S. Steel Mill in the 1950s.
Steel workers moved out here from different parts of the country, and it was a nice community.
Although we're a suburb of Philadelphia and we're right across the river from Trenton, violent crime is relatively unusual in Falls.
That all changes one Saturday morning with a gruesome discovery at a fast food restaurant.
On the morning of February 4th, 1984, the manager arrived to open the restaurant, and upon entering, discovered that someone was laying outside the kitchen area and obviously deceased.
The manager recognizes the woman as the restaurant's night shift manager, 25-year-old Terry Brooks.
He observed Terry Brooks laying on the floor in a pool of blood with a knife stuck in her neck. And he phoned the dispatcher and stayed on the phone until officers got there. I was told that they had a homicide at the Roy Rogers restaurant on Route 1, so I was there pretty quickly. Her body was positioned near the kitchen. There was a butcher knife sticking out of her neck. She had black and blue marks and bruises everywhere, and it looked like hand marks around her neck, like she had been strangled. It was thought that she was still alive until the bag was put over her head because of the moisture in it from her breath. She looked like she had blood under her fingernails and blood on her hand, and that was wrapped in an evidence bag and secured.
There was a rectangular kitchen prep area. That's where you could see both her shoes that were against the wall. To my mind, that was probably the first act of violence that took place, that she was literally pushed right out of her shoes, and that a struggle had taken place right there. Moving around the corner is where the body was found.
It looked like her body had been dragged on the floor to where she laid. Terry had her winter coat on, and her bag was also on the floor, like she was getting ready to leave.
Further examination of the scene reveals evidence of another crime.
In the office, a safe was open. There was a register drawer on the desk.
The coins were scattered all over the floor. It just appeared that whoever did it ransacked the safe.
There was money taken. It had all the earmarkings of a robbery homicide. It was fairly easy for the restaurant to get a count of what was missing, and it was around $2,500.
Looking for more clues, detectives speak to the manager who discovered Terry's body.
When the manager of the restaurant arrived around 6 in the morning, he found the inner vestibule door locked.
The door to the interior of the building was locked, but the drive-through window was partially open.
It appeared that the killer had left through the drive-through window, because the metal pipe that was laid in the track as the kind of security measure to lock it up had been removed and laid to the side. But there was no sign of forced entry in the restaurant.
Police believe Terry was killed sometime after midnight when the restaurant had closed. As detectives continue to process the crime scene, Terry's family discovers that she never returned home from work.
The morning of the murder, Scott, the victim's fiance, knocks on the door to the Brooks family home. At the time, Terry lived with her parents.
We hear a banging at the door, and it was Scott standing there, and he's like, Terry's car's not in the driveway.
He tells them that he was driving by their house on his way to work, and that he noticed Terry's car wasn't there. They then looked in her room and saw that, in fact, she wasn't home. And then Scott picked up the phone and dialed the Roy Rogers.
And he goes, this is George Brooks, Terry Brooks' father. You know, she didn't come home last night. Is she okay? And they said, no, she's not. She, has been murdered. I was kind of shocked they told him over the phone, but I just couldn't believe what was happening. Like, when am I going to wake up? It's a horrible thing.
I was getting ready to go to work when my phone rang. I was getting a call from her stepmother to tell me so that I wouldn't see it on the news, and my heart just sunk.
Terry Brooks grew up in Warminster, Pennsylvania, the oldest of 4 children.
My mom and dad divorced. Terry was in 8th grade, and she kind of took over the mother role after that happened. out of all of us, she was probably the most ambitious. We always thought, Terry would have her own business one day and she'd just light the world on fire.
Terry took jobs in the restaurant industry and earned a reputation as a hard worker.
I worked with Terry at an Italian restaurant. In the beginning, she was a server. I tended bar. She became management after working there for a while. She really, really took pride in her work and how she dealt with people.
Soon after her promotion, she began a year-long romance with her coworker, Scott Keefe.
She met Scott at the restaurant. He was the head chef. They had a good time together.
Terry just came home one day with a ring on her finger, and we were all like, oh my God.
While Terry planned her dream wedding for the upcoming summer, her career also started to take off.
It was her dream to move forward to bigger things in the hotel business. And she had looked into getting a job with the Marriott Corporation.
The position she accepted with the Marriott was to be a manager of a Roy Rogers restaurant.
I first met Terry when I started working at the Roy Rogers. She was my boss. She was always happy. She was very excited about her wedding, and she was excited to go dress shopping.
I know she put the down payment on the honeymoon to Hawaii, and she was talking about the bridesmaid dresses.
Terry and Scott were apartment hunting. There was a lot to do. It was at a time when all new things were happening in her life.
Now, detectives must determine who could have killed this ambitious young woman just a few months before her wedding. They asked the family about Terry's movements in the hours leading up to her murder.
Mr. and Mrs. Brooks last saw Terry the day before, Friday, February 3rd, 1984, when she left for work.
Usually, her fiancé, Scott, would make sure that he went and closed with her every night. And her father was glad that Scott would go and close with her and be there to keep her safe.
Scott was worried about Terry's security at the restaurant. He would go and sit with her while she finished everything up.
Scott tells police he wasn't with Terry the night before. He had stayed home because he was working the early shift the following morning. Neither Scott nor Terry's parents are able to provide police with any leads.
The family was really cooperative with the investigation, and we just nothing that they could volunteer or give us that would indicate that they knew anything about the case.
It was completely out of the blue. There was no reason for them to feel that she was in any danger or in any jeopardy.
I couldn't think of anybody who really disliked Terry, and I can't imagine anybody would dislike her that much to kill her.
Investigators turn their attention to Terry's coworkers.
It looked like it could possibly be a robbery, but the deeper we looked into to see how brutally she was murdered, it had to be more than just a robbery.
Detectives want to know how Terry was thought of by her colleagues.
Terry was a young woman who was very staunch about the procedures, and she enforced them strictly.
She was a by-the-book person, and as long as you did your work the way you were supposed to, there were no problems.
When police ask if Terry's management style made her any enemies, one name keeps coming up.
Steve Daly was an employee that didn't adhere to the procedures. He was a little hot-headed.
Steve scared me, to be honest. He was very rough, quick to anger. I was uncomfortable around him.
Detectives learn that just weeks before the murder, the tension between Terry and Steve hit a breaking point.
He ended up getting fired, and he wasn't too happy about it.
You've got this former employee who had a clear animus towards the victim and is fired by the victim. And add to that that here's an employee who knows how the restaurant operates, who knows the security procedures. He's got the kind of knowledge to be able to commit this crime. So this is somebody who now rises to the top of the list.
Coming up, police zero in on a suspect.
Fingerprints were found on one of the murder weapons.
At that point, he admitted he took the money from the office.
But conflicting statements frustrate detectives.
It was completely a misdirection, a diversion.
How could somebody do this and get away with it?
Until the investigation takes a jaw-dropping turn.
The polygraph operator said he was lying.
It caught me by surprise. I remember him all of a sudden blowing up.
It was the turning point in the investigation.
Police investigating the fatal stabbing of 25-year-old restaurant manager Terry Brooks have learned that a disgruntled coworker lashed out at Terry before he was fired.
If you threaten somebody and they end up dead, you'd have to look at them and look at them seriously.
Steve Daly was a former Marine and had a difficult personality. He didn't like to be told what to do.
Just weeks before the murder, Terry and Steve had a major blowout.
There was an occasion at work where Steve Daly was told to make a hamburger for a customer, and he had just closed out that workspace, so he didn't want to reopen the workspace.
And I remember him all of a sudden blowing up. Steve lost his temper, was screaming and yelling.
He became explosive, at one point even calling Terry a bitch. Terry was alarmed by Daly's behavior.
Terry, in a situation like what happened with Steve, she wouldn't tolerate it.
She didn't waver. So I think that was the frustrating thing for Steve, is he couldn't break her.
And she was like, you need to go home, you are done for the night, and you will talk to the boss the next morning.
Daly storms out of the restaurant, and the next day Terry talks to her manager, tells him what had happened, which of course led to Daly being fired.
That did little to stop Steve's aggressive behavior.
Even after he was fired, Daly would return to the restaurant and buy food and have meals there.
He went back just to annoy her. Just, here I am. You can't throw me out now. It was very upsetting to her.
So, given his personality and his conduct, that certainly seems to provide a motive.
Did Steve Daly's harassment escalate into a fatal act of revenge? Police bring him in for an interview.
When we tracked Daly down, one of the first things he tells us that he knew at some point the police would be coming to talk to him. Daly said that he didn't get along with Terry, that they clashed often. In fact, he said that if she'd been a man, he would have punched her. Daly's excuse for why he was going back to the restaurant was that he was dating somebody who worked there. I don't know that I buy that, but that's the reason he gave.
Investigators ask where Steve was the night of the murder.
He says that he was trying to get into a club and that he was not permitted access to the club. So then he just drove around for several hours. Investigators go to the club, they look at the security footage. They can't find any footage of Daly being denied entry. So this is not a hard alibi that can allow you to say, okay, this person's eliminated. Just the opposite.
With no way to prove his whereabouts when Terry was killed, police ask Steve to take a polygraph.
So a polygraph is a useful investigative tool. It can help us rule people in or out. So Daly agrees to take the polygraph, and without question, he passed. This guy looks like a good suspect. So when you have momentum build like that, and then it crashes to a halt, it's hard to swallow.
Police can't verify Steve's alibi, but with no evidence against him, he's free to go.
Stephen Daly was pushed down lower on the list of suspects, but you never eliminate somebody until you make sure that they are completely not involved.
Investigators turn their focus on the Roy Rogers staff who worked with Terry the night of the murder.
During the investigation, we knew that we had to interview the employees to see what the atmosphere was when they left, if there was any arguments. Everybody consented to have their fingerprints taken.
The evening that Terry was murdered, there were 4 employees that she was working with: Patricia, Ron, Barb, and Dan. And each of those employees was identified and interviewed separately.
Patricia tells investigators that just before closing, Terry discovered that money had gone missing from Barb's cash register.
The employees got in an argument, and there was $40 that was supposedly missing.
Terry was going to get to the bottom of this. It wasn't a minor event. She took it very seriously. She began questioning different employees. Where did it go? Why is it missing?
Terry played everything by the book. if there's any money missing and you are caught being the person that's been hitting the till. There's no tolerance for stealing.
Terry cared about her employees, but some people didn't like her because she could be tough when she needed to be tough.
Patricia indicated that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. If you're stealing money from Roy Rogers and you're an employee there, that's a fireable offense. So did this provide a motive for murder?
As Terry attempted to unmask the thief, the employees began to point fingers.
Barb told Terry that she thought Ron did it. So he's now being confronted with the idea that he took this money, and he actually turned his pockets inside out to prove, hey, he didn't have any cash on him.
Could Ron have killed Terry in a rage after being accused of stealing? As detectives look closer at Ron, fingerprint analysis provides crucial new evidence.
The employees who worked that night clean up before they close.
Working the later shift, you had to clean up everything, wash all the equipment, sweep them off the floors, wipe down all the tables, stuff like that.
So I thought that whoever was in there after closing could have possibly left fingerprints.
We began matching up fingerprints that they'd lifted from different services to elimination prints taken from different employees. And it was discovered that Ron's fingerprints were found on the drive-through window and on the trash bag that was wrapped around Terry's face. Here we go. This is somebody that we need to look at.
Investigators working to solve the Terry Brooks homicide have just got a match for fingerprints left at the crime scene.
The evening that Terry was murdered, there were 4 employees that she was working with, including an employee named Ron, and Ron's fingerprints were found on the drive-through window and on the trash bag that was wrapped around Terry's face.
Detectives ask Ron how his fingerprints ended up on the bag used to suffocate Terry and on the drive-through window, the killer's likely escape route.
Ron said that one of his responsibilities at the restaurant was to take care of the trash. So his fingerprints would have been on that bag because that was part of his job there. Ron also said that he'd covered for some other employees for their break time at the drive-thru, so that's why his print was there in the window.
Police aren't able to determine if the window had been properly cleaned at closing, so Ron's excuse is plausible. Still, detectives want to know his whereabouts after he left work.
Ron said that he left the restaurant shortly after 1 a.m. with coworkers, and that he got home about 1:15 and talked to his mom before he went to bed. We checked out Ron's alibi, discovered that he had indeed gotten home and stayed home all night.
With Ron all but cleared, police get new details from another employee about the money that had gone missing from Barb's cash register.
We learned the $40 that was supposedly missing, it was found at a later time.
The missing money had mysteriously reappeared in the drop safe.
I think it's fair to say that Terry might have thought that it was Barb who had taken this money. My impression was that Terry was suspicious of Barb.
Police also learned that it was Barb's duty to close down the drive-thru.
Those two things combined, the missing $40 and the fact that it was Barb's responsibility to lock that drive-thru window, and that ultimately it's found unlocked, and it's believed to be where the killer left, puts her at the top of the suspect list.
According to the work schedule, Barb and Terry were the last 2 employees at the restaurant.
The policy of Roy Rogers for employees that were going to work past the end of their shift was that they would lock the doors and that there would be a minimum of 2 employees there.
Could an argument between Terry and Barb over the missing money have turned deadly?
Barb said that she was sent home early by Terry, and she was insistent that she close the window and place the pipe in the track to lock. And in looking into Barb's whereabouts, we discovered that she was picked up by her boyfriend, so she had an alibi. So it's conceivable that Terry was alone in the restaurant, working into the early hours of February 4th doing inventory.
Police later confirmed the alibis of every employee who worked the night of the murder. When the autopsy report arrives, investigators hope it will give them a new lead.
The pathologist found that Terry had been strangled, and the bone in the back of her neck was severed from the stab wound.
There was a serious brain hemorrhage that was the result of her head being repeatedly banged against that hard concrete floor. And looking at that stab wound to her spine, it was likely she was conscious, but paralyzed when the plastic trash bag was wrapped around her head.
The autopsy report lists each of Terry's severe injuries as potentially fatal, but indicates asphyxiation as the likely cause of death.
There was no indication that Terry had been sexually assaulted. You can't help but look at the way that Terry was killed and not think that the person who did this had such a high level of rage that they absolutely wanted to guarantee that she was dead. Material was collected from the knife that was left lodged in Terry's throat and under Terry's right ring finger, where the pathologist had identified a defensive wound. At the time of this murder in 1984, there was no DNA technology. Analysis of blood was really relegated to blood typing. By today's standards, the evidence was limited.
As the investigation continues, Terry's loved ones struggle to make sense of her violent death.
The funeral home called the morning of the viewing, and they said, could somebody come down and take a look at Terry? And they had her laid out in the casket, and she didn't look good. You could see the cut marks in her neck, and you could see the bruises on the back of her hand, and they had makeup on her too, and you could still see it didn't look like Terry. I said when I got home to my dad, I think we should keep the casket closed. We didn't want people to remember her looking like that.
As the Brooks family prepares to bury their eldest daughter, Falls Township lives in fear of a brutal killer still at large.
It was a young person that was killed, at her job. So I think the community as a whole regarded this as a frightening homicide.
It caused quite a bit of fear due to the fact that it was so violent, and most people in this area would think this shouldn't happen in our town.
I really thought it probably was, a robbery. Unfortunately, they killed her instead of just robbing the place. But you don't know if somebody's lurking out there, and they're going to do it again.
Less than 2 weeks after Terry's murder, the town's worst fear appears to become a horrifying reality.
At another Roy Rogers, an assistant manager was attacked coming out of the bathroom. She was hit in the head. She fell to the floor, and the actor ran away before she could identify him.
The restaurant manager survives. But just a week later in nearby Scranton, there's another brutal attack.
A male attacker waited in the parking lot until there was a lone female employee, then made entry into the restaurant. But the money from the restaurant had already been dropped into the safe, so he took the female employee's money and then stabbed her to death.
Detectives fear they have a serial killer on the loose.
And when you take a community that was already stressed, it made it even worse. And if you've got an individual who's going from restaurant to restaurant and just robbing people, and they have no personal connection to the victim, it's terrifying. It took it up a notch.
Three weeks after the murder of Terry Brooks, police have learned another restaurant employee has been stabbed to death in nearby Scranton.
Scranton's just up the turnpike, and it's not really that far from us. So anything that would indicate a violent armed robbery, we would have to look into.
It was such a similar homicide, a lone female employee inside a restaurant, a male attacker, and the use of a knife.
Investigators learn that a suspect has already been arrested. Could he also be Terry Brooks' killer?
The person that committed this homicide in Scranton was a man named Steve Duffy. We sent investigators to go to Scranton to attempt to interview Duffy, and by the time we arrive, he has lawyered up. But we got a warrant to obtain his fingerprints and compare them to the fingerprints from the scene. But in the end, a fingerprint comparison indicated no connection to the homicide at our Roy Rogers.
Police are also unable to identify a suspect in the assault of the manager at the other Roy Rogers location.
You go through this cycle of building momentum, and then you hit a wall. It's disheartening.
It's been a month since Terry Brooks was found dead, and the killer is still at large.
Something that brutal and that terrifying, you have to try to solve it, no matter how long it takes. But when the leads start running out, you get awful upset.
As weeks turned to months, and you identify suspects and then eliminate them over and over again. The case went cold. An investigator, by necessity, has to move on to other cases. But for a family that loses a loved one to a homicide, they don't move on.
When it first happened, you just assumed it was going to be solved. You think, well, how could somebody do this and get away with it? My dad's hair turned white within a year. He lost weight. It just destroyed him.
It was hard for Terry's family, having to process a heartache of losing their daughter and not having closure over it. I couldn't imagine not having answers.
There are no significant developments in the investigation for nearly 14 years. Then, in 1998, Falls Township's new police chief orders a fresh look at the Terry Brooks murder, and a local prosecutor is assigned to the case.
One of the primary reasons that the police chief put this renewed focus on this case was that there had been developments in DNA technology during the 1990s. And part of the point of my assignment, to have someone come in with a fresh point of view, it was just a matter of reviewing all of those reports and reviewing all the physical evidence. It caught me by surprise a bit when I opened up the bag that contained Terry's wallet. I found that you could still clearly smell Terry's perfume. And because I wasn't expecting it, it's one of those things that sort of triggers your emotions and brings you closer to the victim.
A team is assembled for the renewed investigation.
Lori said, take a look at this homicide. And she asked me what I thought, and apparently my answers were well enough to get me assigned to work on it.
At the time that the homicide occurred, other robberies at fast food restaurants in the area caused law enforcement to form the initial theory that it was likely to have been a robbery.
We had the advantage of knowing that the robbery-homicide track didn't work out, so we could start with a different theory. There were two things that really jumped out. One, that we could conduct victimology interviews and talk to some people who weren't interviewed back at the time. And two, develop some kind of forensic signature for the killer.
As the lab works to extract the killer's DNA from crime scene evidence, investigators learn more about the victim, Terry Brooks.
Victimology essentially means learning everything you possibly can about the victim. Everybody who we spoke to described Terry Brooks as intelligent, ambitious, friendly, well-loved by her family and friends. Detective Whitney spent a lot of time with the family to gain their trust and to reassure them that we were working on the case diligently.
Nelson and Lori did seem like the power couple. Both of them were extremely intelligent, and they were driven to get this solved.
Detectives hope new interviews will bring to light crucial details that could help the case.
You just never know when you're going to get some new piece of information that's going to put us on a track to identify who did this.
Some of the people who we spoke to, they were quite young when this homicide occurred, in their late teens or early 20s, and having more life experience, were a bit more open than they might have felt they could be in the 1980s.
Detectives reach out to people who weren't interviewed in the 1984 investigation, including those who worked with Terry before her employment at Roy Rogers.
I got a call from Falls Township Police. They wanted to speak to me about the Terry Brooks murder, and they just said to me, "We'd like to hear your thoughts on it."
Cindy knew Terry well. They worked together, and Cindy kind of laid out what was going on in the victim's life.
During her interview with investigators, Cindy drops a bombshell.
What Cindy told us presented a completely different image of this homicide. It turned out Terry's murder wasn't what it appeared to be. And now you couldn't help but conclude everything's pointing to one person.
"14 years after the murder of Terry Brooks, cold case investigators have just received shocking new information from a friend and former coworker of Terry's.
We asked what things did Terry share with, Cindy as a friend.
And I said to them, Terry and her fiancé Scott, their upcoming wedding at first was exciting for Terry. But I proceeded to tell them that the week before Terry had been murdered, she wanted to call off the wedding. She just realized that's not what she wanted.
We knew Terry and Scott had just put down a deposit on their honeymoon, and their wedding was upcoming. And in the initial investigation, the officers that conducted it came away with the impression that they were a happy couple.
There hadn't really been anything in the report that indicated there were any problems in Terry Brooks's relationship with Scott Keefe. But we did learn that Terry confided to some of her friends that she wasn't entirely sure she was going to go through with getting married.
Mr. and Mrs. Brooks felt close to Scott. He was the young man that was going to marry their daughter. To her parents, Scott was this loving, caring fiancé who would check on Terry and drive by to make sure she was, safe and give her rides.
Some of Terry's friends had a very different impression of Scott.
Cindy Bradney told us that there had been some problems in the relationship. For me, that was a red flag.
I think through time and her changing jobs and the fact that she was moving on and going for her dream and he was stuck where he was, his jealousy became an issue and he was very possessive. Scott would not let Terry stay alone. She was afraid to tell him she didn't want to be married. She was afraid to call it off. She didn't know what she was going to do, to the point where she was in tears.
Police get further insight into Terry and Scott's relationship from Terry's siblings.
When she started dating Scott, we just were all scratching our heads, like, what is she doing with him? He was just not the kind of guy she always dated. He wasn't fun-loving. All he wanted to do was sit there and drink. And that was just unlike her. It just seemed like he wanted to keep us away from her and him. It just makes you think back, like maybe he did have signs of an abusive person. But at the time, I just really thought it was a robbery, and she was killed during the robbery.
Detectives have a new perspective on Scott and how the supposedly grieving fiancé might have avoided suspicion at the time of Terry's death.
My dad thought Scott really loved Terry. He thought if she loved him, I'll love him too.
Mr. Brooks was a very kind man, and in fact, George bought Scott the suit that he wore to Terry's funeral.
Her father just had such a big heart that I don't think he believed that someone that his daughter fell in love with could harm her. And I believe Scott played on that.
Scott becomes someone that we think may have done this. Examining the crime scene through the lens of, what if Scott did this? Okay, that's how he got in. She let him in. We were told that he had a practice of going to the restaurant and sitting with her while she worked after hours. And it's personal, it's rage, and then the action of placing that bag over her face to kind of depersonalize her is a telltale mark of what someone does when they've killed somebody that they're close to. And now it becomes a priority for us to see if the forensic track, if the evidence points that way.
Investigators hope the killer's DNA can be extracted from the crime scene evidence collected back in 1984.
It was a potential concern that they might not be able to find any usable DNA due to the amount of time that had gone by.
Luckily, the knife that was left lodged in Terry's throat and the material collected from under Terry's right ring finger, where the pathologist had identified a defensive wound to that area, yielded an unknown male DNA profile.
It was highly unlikely under the circumstances that DNA material would have come from anyone other than the perpetrator. The next thing we had to do was obtain a DNA sample from our suspect. Scott Keefe did not have a criminal record at that time. He didn't have any DNA samples on file with an agency such as the FBI. One of the
things that we learned from the laboratory expert was that cigarette butts are an excellent potential source of DNA because they have saliva on them. And at that point, we actually knew what kind of cigarettes Keith smoked, and we knew where he lived.
Police hatch a plan to secretly obtain a sample of Scott Keefe's DNA.
We didn't at that point want to obtain a subpoena to obtain DNA from him directly because we wanted to interview him first. We wanted to set that up in the most advantageous possible way, and we were concerned that he was a flight risk.
It was very important to us to be very careful about who knew he was a suspect and who we shared that information with. And it was also very important to us to not be caught doing surveillance. In 1998, Scott's life had kind of come full circle from where it was in 1984. In 1984, he was living at home with his parents. He had gone on to live with a girlfriend and then marry. They'd had a child together, but then they split up and got divorced. And in 1998, he was back home living with his mom.
Under Pennsylvania law, trash was considered to be abandoned property once it was put out in front of the house for collection. So Detective Whitney immediately took custody of it, took it directly to the laboratory that was doing the DNA analysis.
I knew I was going to get a definitive answer one way or the other. Could be him, could be somebody else. It was that anticipation of I'm going to get a final result here that's going to matter a great deal in this investigation.
Police investigating the 1984 murder of Terry Brooks have secretly collected a DNA sample from her fiancé, Scott Keefe.
We had to obtain a DNA sample from our suspect, so we collected cigarette butts that were in the trash.
The sample is compared to DNA found on Terry's body.
I'll never forget the phone call I got where the doctor at the lab informed me that there was a match from Scott's cigarettes to the crime scene evidence.
It was the turning point in the investigation. That was the point at which we knew we would be able to prove that Scott Keefe was the killer. Although we had very solid physical evidence against Keefe, it's always better if you have an incriminating statement from the defendant. We asked Mr. Keefe to come to the police station as one of the friends and family members that we were interviewing as part of our investigation.
We believed that he would cooperate with us. We believed that he would come across as wanting to help, that he would try to sell us the same story that he was the grieving fiancé, that he'd been telling people for 15 years.
As predicted, Scott agrees to cooperate with police.
We had a strategy to conduct that interview on the anniversary date of the murder. People pay attention to dates. It could raise a person's anxiety level and make them more apt to make mistakes.
The interview begins, and Scott tells a familiar tale.
He told us the same story that he had told others over the years, that they were happy, this was the love of his life, and that somebody else had taken her away from him. If we came on too hard, we were too aggressive in our questioning, we felt he would lawyer up and stop the interview. So slowly we built towards the question of whether Scott had anything to do with this or any knowledge of it. And once we got to that point, we asked Scott if he would take a polygraph.
You can never force anyone to undergo a polygraph examination, but he agreed to that.
The polygraph operator said he was lying. So now Scott started to say things like, I didn't mean for this to happen. But then he caught himself and said, but I didn't do it. But over time, that culminated at one point in him saying, she came at me first. And that was the first time he put himself at the scene.
Investigators keep the pressure on. And finally, Scott breaks.
He admitted that she essentially told him that she wanted to break up with him, and he was enraged because of that.
At one point, he punched her in the face. They struggled for a while in that kitchen prep area. A knife had fallen onto the floor, and he knocked her down and straddled her, choking her and banging her head repeatedly against the floor. But then he grabbed the knife and stabbed her with it, and it stuck in her throat. Then, in his words, he bent over to make sure she was dead, saw that she was still breathing, so he grabbed the trash can liner to wrap around her face to make sure that she would in fact die, and he said he didn't want to look at her face.
At that point, he admitted he took the money from the office.
He said he exited to the drive-through window to make it look like a robbery. Scott told us that the reason he went to the Brooks family home the morning of the murder was to make him look innocent. So he's surrounded by her family when the crime is supposedly discovered. It was completely a misdirection, a diversion that worked for 15 years for him.
Scott is charged with first-degree murder.
I was elated. I was like, thank God they finally nailed him. Because we waited a long time. Getting the answers of who killed my sister really gave my dad some comfort. But I think he was still in disbelief that Scott did it.
We were just so happy we could tell her family that the person who had killed their daughter was in prison, and we were confident he was going to be convicted.
At trial, Scott Keefe is found guilty and sentenced to life in prison.
Terry was a tremendous young person who had unlimited potential. She had good relationships with her family. It's really a terrible tragedy that her life ended this way.
It's just so sad that somebody so young, because of standing up for themselves and wanting to move forward in their lives, gets their life cut short.
Terry would have had a very bright future, and I'm sure she would have had a ton of kids, and we'd be hanging out right now.
Terry would love to be remembered with those big eyes, that smile, her kindness in her heart, and a person with a goal. She was truly a lovely, lovely person.
A brilliant scientist and devoted family man.
Eugene was a beautiful person.
He definitely wanted to change the world for the better.
Found viciously beaten to death.
32 lacerations to the face and body.
He had suffered a crushed trachea.
Police uncover a trail of evidence and search for a brutal killer.
The volume of blood told the story of how far the struggle went.
There were numerous items of evidence seized.
Several suspects emerge.
We did receive tips that it was a professional hit.
He was doing work that might have threatened someone enough that they murdered him.
I knew him to be someone who would maybe not want to cross.
Until the case takes a jaw-dropping turn.
And then a bombshell was dropped.
We thought that we were really onto something, and that kind of fell apart.
And the truth is revealed.
You're telling a family that you've arrested the right people.
We were back to square one.
She wasn't telling us all this stuff out of the goodness of her heart.
It just didn't sound like it could be possible.
Norwich is a small city in eastern Connecticut, known as the Rose of New England.
The city of Norwich is an old mill town. It's not as affluent as the rest of Connecticut. There's poverty here, there's hard luck here. But overall, it's a good city. It's one of those places that doesn't change much.
But on the night of May 14th, 2004, Norwich was shaken to its core by a horrible crime.
911. I was coming here to look at an apartment and there's someone laying on the ground. He's not moving and he looks like he's dead.
Police and paramedics race to the scene.
They found a white male in his 50s. There was a lot of blood. It was a horrific scene. And the paramedic indicated that the unresponsive person was deceased. Upon arrival at the scene, we could tell that there was a vicious beating with numerous strikes to the face with some unknown object.
He had suffered quite a lot of injuries to his face and neck. And there was a pattern on his clothing. It looked like it may have been shoe impressions.
It may have been a case of someone either stepping or stomping upon the victim.
The victim's shoes were missing, a wallet, and some other items were missing that he would have normally had.
The missing items suggest a robbery, but what explains the viciousness of the attack?
The volume of blood told the story of how far the struggle went from the side of the house to a car parked in the driveway. The violent struggle had moved throughout the backyard to the location where the body was found. There's always a possibility that it was a random crime, but the manner of death did raise our suspicions about it being possibly more of a personal nature.
The forensic team gets to work.
They collected the blood, hair, fiber, evidence, anything that they could find at the scene.
But this crime scene poses unique challenges for investigators.
The property itself appeared to have been in the process of being cleaned up.
There was a lot of debris. There was broken glass, and there was metal, there was, bike parts.
It was difficult to see if any of that material had anything to do with the crime scene. We did not determine the murder weapon at the scene.
There were numerous items of evidence seized.
We saw a hose in the backyard that had blood on it. A keychain was found at the scene, and a brick with some apparent blood residue. The situation with the house told us that the victim was not residing in the house.
Detectives turned to the 911 caller for a statement.
She said she had seen a for rent sign, and she called the number.
The woman who answered said that her husband, the owner, was at the house.
She says, "Oh yeah, my husband's down there working on the property. We should go talk to him."
So she went to the property and discovered the body in the driveway. She dialed 911 at approximately 10:55 p.m.
Police now believe the victim is the owner of the rental property, New Hampshire resident Eugene Maloff.
I conveyed that information to the New Hampshire police, and they were able to notify Joanne Maloff that we had discovered someone that appeared to be her husband.
I received a call at 2 o'clock in the morning from Joanne, and she said, Eugene's been murdered. And it just didn't sound like it could be possible, like it was a bad dream. It just rocked my world.
"56-year-old Eugene Maloff was born and raised in Norwich.
Eugene and I were very close, all through grade school, high school. We just loved each other's company. He was just a down-to-earth, sensitive, nice guy.
Okay, come on. Let's do our standard dance.
Eugene and his wife Joanne were married young and soon after started a family.
Joanne was made for Eugene. They were both very outgoing and had a lot of warmth. Eugene was always very loving to the kids, just very gregarious and sweet. We knew from a very, very young age that he was a genius.
He got his education from Harvard and then MIT, and he had a doctorate in environmental engineering.
He wrote books about outer space and nuclear energy. There aren't many people like him who can both understand the science and communicate the science.
After completing his PhD, Eugene embraced cold fusion, a controversial theory about limitless energy.
Gene got deeply involved in cold fusion, which was contrary to a lot of conventional thought at the time. If cold fusion realizes its potential, you would have unlimited alternative energy. Gene definitely wanted to change the world for the better.
Gene was trying to follow his dream and go on the path less chosen, and he was working on new ways that we could stop global warming and have a better world.
All right, there we are. That's our little house.
Eugene always told his parents that he wanted them to keep the house in Norwich. He was sentimental and he just loved those old memories.
Now, the house that held Eugene's fondest memories had become the scene of his family's worst nightmare.
That was the house that he grew up in, and although he moved to New Hampshire, he had kept the family property and had rented it out for years.
Detectives call Eugene's wife, Joanne, and question her about her husband's last known movements.
She said on this particular day, he had come down to clean up the property, making sure that it was all suitable for renters, and he had a dumpster delivered. Joanne Maloff had spoken to her husband earlier that afternoon, and in fact, she had expected he would be home in New Hampshire by 9 o'clock or so that evening.
Police learned that Eugene had driven his minivan to Norwich that day.
She described the van, and it had some unique markings on it, and also had New Hampshire plates. Mrs. Maloff said the van should have been on the property.
But there was no van in the driveway.
The first thing you're thinking of is that the killer had taken off with Mr. Maloff's van.
He's a family man murdered and brutally beaten. I think that shocks the conscience of any neighborhood.
We felt that whoever was driving that van was complicit with the homicide of Dr. Maloff.
Coming up, investigators uncover conflicting evidence.
They had been involved in a theft of a motor vehicle and some kind of violent struggle.
Blood was sent to a laboratory, but there was no match. It wasn't logical.
And disturbing secrets.
I realized that there were people out there that weren't happy with Gene.
Whose blood is that and where did it come from?
He wanted to commit suicide and was shaking and hyperventilating.
Some of the things regarding her whereabouts on the night of the murder hadn't added up.
I had to accept it, but it was a terrible thing.
Nuclear scientist Eugene Maloff has been found violently beaten to death at the rental property he owns. And police suspect the killer fled in his van.
We put out a bolo, be on the lookout to all the local police departments for the van.
While detectives wait for news on the van, they interview neighbors.
The purpose of the neighborhood canvass to try and figure out when was the last time Mr. Maloff was seen alive.
We spoke to a neighborhood friend of Dr. Maloff. He indicated that he had seen him mowing the lawn earlier that day, and nothing was suspicious at the time. He did indicate that at about 8:30 p.m. that evening, the van was not there, which gave us a time frame to start working with.
Dr. Maloff had been mowing the lawn. Everything had grass cuttings covering it, from abandoned bicycles and debris on the ground, but there wasn't a stitch of grass on these keys. So we believe that those keys were dropped after Dr. Maloff had mowed the lawn, which would have been sometime around the time of the homicide.
Detectives hope neighbors can help them identify the owner of the keys. But then, police receive an urgent call from a local casino.
We were notified that Dr. Maloff's van had been located in the employee parking lot of the Foxwoods Casino, which was approximately 7 miles away from the crime scene. When we arrived, the tailpipe was cold as if it had been there for several hours. The van was towed back to the City of Norwich Public Works garage so that the state police, major crime, unit could process the van.
They searched the van for hairs, fibers, and anything that looked like blood.
They didn't obtain any fingerprints from the door handles or steering wheel, which indicated to us that the driver quite possibly was wearing gloves.
Investigators hope security footage will help them identify the driver of Eugene's van.
It was a hazy, foggy evening, and we weren't able to gather much evidence at all from the cameras at the Foxwoods Casino.
With the killer still at large, police turn their attention to Eugene's wife, Joanne, in New Hampshire.
Probably a 3-hour drive from New Hampshire to the crime scene. The Maloff family, they had alibis, and they were not suspects at this time. Joanne Maloff couldn't provide anybody's name that would have any intention of hurting her husband.
Police asked Joanne for information about recent tenants at Eugene's rental property in Norwich.
We needed to obtain the identity of all individuals that lived in the house. They were definitely persons of interest. Joanne Maloff told us that Gene had evicted Pat and Roy Anderson approximately 2 weeks prior to the murder.
Gene's tenants stopped paying the rent, and Eugene eventually had to look into how to get them out, because I think they were there for a good 6 months before they actually left. Gene didn't want to be cruel to people, and I think he really gave them a lot of leeway, but enough is enough.
For detectives, it's the first break in the investigation.
Pat and Roy Anderson had been living at Mr. Maloff's property for a long period of time up till the eviction.
My immediate questions were, where are the people that were evicted? How do we locate the Andersons?
Luckily, a tip from a neighbor leads police to the Andersons' son, Chad Schaefer, who lives nearby with his girlfriend, Candace Foster.
One of the investigators went to their apartment to get information about Chad's mom and dad, Pat and Roy.
The purpose of his interview was to determine whether or not the Andersons had seen Gene Maloff on the property, if they had seen him when they had last seen him.
Chad claims that his parents had not seen Eugene since he served them the eviction notice.
Chad Schaefer said there were no hard feelings between the Andersons and Gene Maloff.
Police asked Chad for his whereabouts on the night of the murder.
Chad and Candace indicated that they were both home with their newborn on the night in question, and that was their alibi.
Chad cooperates with police and provides them with his parents' new address.
I subsequently went out to Pat and Roy Anderson's new rental out in Montville, Connecticut, and interviewed them about Gene's death. Pat Anderson, she corroborated Chad Schaefer's assessment that when they were evicted, they moved on and there was no feelings of animosity between themselves and Gene Maloff.
Detectives still want to know where the Andersons were at the time of the murder.
Patricia Anderson worked in a nursing home. Ian said she was at home after working previously during the day.
Police ask Roy point blank if he has an alibi around the time that Eugene was murdered.
He indicated that he had worked from 5 p.m. to 1 a.m. in the morning out at the Foxwoods Casino. And Dr. Maloff's van had been located in the employee parking lot of the Foxwoods Casino.
That was very suspicious to the investigator. From the crime scene to the Foxwoods Casino parking lot, it's not far, a 15-minute drive. And then you think that maybe this eviction thing was a personal thing. And you have as investigators to figure out who did it so that person can be held accountable.
Police investigating the murder of cold fusion scientist Eugene Maloff now have their first real suspect. His recently evicted tenant, Roy Anderson, works at the same casino where Eugene's stolen van was found on the night of the murder.
Roy reported that there was no animosity about the eviction. There was no problem between Eugene and Roy. But Dr. Malov's van had been found at the Foxwoods lot.
Angered by the eviction, had Roy killed Eugene in revenge?
We got a list of names of employees that night, and we verified that Roy Anderson was in fact working from 5 p.m. until 1 a.m., and that provided him with a pretty solid alibi that he was not within the city of Norwich at all. Pat and Roy Anderson were both individuals of interest, but they had alibis.
Police want to know if anyone else was living in their house at the time of the eviction.
One of the things that we learned in talking to Pat and Roy, they would bring other people in to help pay for rooms.
We needed to obtain the location of all individuals that lived in the house.
It turns out one of the Anderson subletters is well known to police.
Lenny Campbell was a friend of Roy's, and they allowed Lenny to stay in the basement of the house.
I personally had run into him a few times during the course of my patrol duties. I knew him to be an individual that someone would maybe not want to cross. The Andersons, when they were evicted, Lenny moved out with them to their new place.
Police want to speak to Lenny, but the Andersons say he recently packed up and left without an explanation.
He moved out shortly after Eugene's murder, and investigators thought it was suspicious.
When police try to track Lenny down, they find he's moved out of state.
Lenny Campbell was working on a farm up in Massachusetts. Lenny denied ever even having contact with Eugene Malov.
Lenny isn't talking, and there's no evidence connecting him to the crime scene.
At this point in the investigation, we really need some solid forensic evidence that somebody was complicit in the murder of Eugene Malov.
Police receive the autopsy report, and it sheds more light on how Eugene was killed.
The medical examiner's office indicated approximately 32 lacerations to the face and body.
And he had suffered a crushed trachea.
What possibly could have sparked such a vicious assault?
We did receive tips throughout the course of the investigation saying that it was a professional hit.
Was Eugene assassinated for his research into alternative energy?
I thought that perhaps because cold fusion was so controversial, that maybe it was some kind of planned setup.
I do believe there's always a danger to somebody that's going to rock the boat. I realized that Gene's passion for countering big oil meant that there were plenty of people out there that weren't happy with Gene.
It occurred to me that, he was doing work that might have threatened someone enough that they would have murdered him.
We delved into it, and based on the crime scene and the circumstances in which he was killed, I don't think a professional hitman would go about his business in that manner. It just didn't add up. It wasn't logical.
Police are running out of leads, but then a witness comes forward with a bizarre account from the night of the murder.
We came in contact with a shuttle driver for a nearby hotel sometime between 8 p.m. and 10 p.m. on the night of the murder. He had pulled up to a traffic light and saw a van similar to the doctor's van, and he noticed the operator of the van, a white male, was wearing socks on his hands.
Obviously, you start to think, well, if the person's wearing socks on their hands, they don't want to transfer any evidence onto a steering wheel.
Whoever was driving that van with hands covered with socks was possibly complicit with the homicide. Gene Malov's van had been moved into a fenced-in compound, and we examined it again for anything that we may have missed or the state police may have missed, and we seized a few items to include a plastic bag.
Police submit the bag to the state forensic lab for analysis.
And as a result of that, a fingerprint came back. It was the first piece of evidence that would place somebody in that van, possibly on the night of the murder.
The print is run through the police database.
The fingerprint belonged to a local individual from the Norwich area.
When we ran this person's record, they had a record of burglaries.
He was the type of guy that wouldn't have any problems breaking into your car. Maybe Eugene Malov got killed for it.
Police have a fresh lead in the murder of Eugene Malov. A fingerprint on a plastic bag found in the scientist's stolen van is matched to a local car burglar.
The results of that examination indicated that a print on the bag belonged to a Nicholas Gardner.
Police track the suspect down and bring him in for questioning.
He was very nonchalant about the fact that he had broken into the van, but when it was brought to his attention that that vehicle was used following a homicide, his demeanor shifted dramatically, and he became very nervous at that point.
When police grill him further, he makes a startling admission.
He said that he broke into a police impound lot.
He explained that he had broken into the impound lot and was burglarizing the cars. And that would explain how his fingerprints had been found in Mr. Malov's van.
Police confirm his story when his prints are found on other vehicles in the lot.
Nicholas was definitely wrong place, wrong time, and had no clue that the van that he was entering was involved in the homicide of Gene Malov.
Nicholas is charged with the burglaries, but it's a dead end in the search for Eugene's killer. Then, police get a call that reignites the case.
We received a phone call from the New Britain Police Department, 40 minutes away from the city of Norwich. A New Britain police officer had come in contact with two subjects. They were in a parking lot. They were asleep in the vehicle. It was a stolen vehicle. It had been reported stolen the same night of Dr. Malov's murder.
When the officer looked inside the car, he made an alarming discovery.
They had been found with blood inside their vehicle. And so obviously the first inclination is, whose blood is that and where did it come from?
The men are arrested and taken to the station.
When they were taken into custody, they were identified as Joseph Riley and Gary McAvoy. Officers at the scene observed that Riley and McAvoy had evidence of some kind of violent struggle.
Is it possible these two men were involved in Eugene's murder?
We wanted to either rule them into our homicide scene or rule them out.
So investigators from Norwich went up and spoke with Riley and McAvoy at the lockup in New Britain.
Police interview Riley and McAvoy in separate rooms. They press Riley about the bloodstains in the car and scratches on his arms and legs.
Joe Riley told the detectives that he and McAvoy ended up in an altercation with one another.
They both said that they got into a fight in the car, and that's how they had the blood in the car.
Investigators question the pair about Eugene's homicide.
During Riley's interview, he made some statements that really caught our attention. He asked, did the old man get the kicked out of him? But the manner of death of Gene Malov had not been relayed to Riley at that time.
How did Riley seem to know details about how Eugene was killed? McAvoy's response to questioning raises more red flags.
When the officer advised him that he was being investigated for a potential homicide, Gary McAvoy became very distraught. He indicated that he wanted to commit suicide and at one point curled up in a fetal position on the floor and was shaking and hyperventilating.
The statements provided by Riley and McAvoy were suspicious to the investigators.
Police bring in the hotel shuttle driver who claimed he saw someone driving Eugene's van on the night of the murder.
He told us that the operator of the van was a white male.
A photo array was offered to the witness, and he pointed out to Joseph Riley as the driver of the minivan that he saw that night.
Police now have a witness placing one of their suspects inside Eugene Maloff's van on the night he was murdered.
Riley and McAvoy had been involved in a theft of a motor vehicle and a burglary, and they did have evidence of violent struggle, and the witness picks Riley out of a photo lineup.
Police still lack physical evidence, so they obtain the men's DNA to compare to samples collected from the crime scene and the van.
Evidence was sent up to the Connecticut State Police Forensic Laboratory.
When results come back, it's a major break.
We received a phone call from the forensic lab saying that the hair in Mr. Maloff's van was a match to Mr. McAvoy. Okay, well, that's a blockbuster.
We had solid forensic evidence, and we're going to move forward with the warrant.
Riley and McAvoy are charged with Eugene's murder.
I was happy for the family that maybe they'd get some closure on this case.
But then, investigators receive a disturbing call.
We thought we were on strong footing based on the solid forensic evidence from the van, and the case was going to move forward. And then a bombshell was dropped.
Joseph Riley and Gary McAvoy are charged for the murder of Eugene Maloff after one of McAvoy's hairs is matched to a hair found in Eugene's van. But then, police receive news that rocks the case.
Bombshell was dropped by the state forensic lab. The lab reached out to us and said there was a mistake, and that McAvoy's hair was not at the crime scene and were not in the van.
There was a clerical error at the laboratory.
And somewhere at the lab there was confusion over the item numbers. So the hair fiber they tested, they thought came from the van, in fact came from the hair of the suspects up in prison. And as a result, the state of Connecticut decided they were not going to pursue homicide charges against Riley or McAvoy.
We thought that we were really onto something, and that kind of fell apart.
At this point, we were back to square one.
You're telling a family who lost a loved one to violent crime that you've arrested the right people. And that falls apart, and then we say to the Maloff family, I'm sorry we couldn't do better.
I had to accept it, but it was a terrible thing. I would cry on the way to work, and I think when you go through a tragedy, your world becomes very small. Joanne was very upset, and I saw her break down once when we were going someplace. I was following her, and she lost her way. She just was devastated at that point.
When the investigation went on so long, I had a feeling it was just one of those random events, and we would never learn anything more of it. I think I pretty much accepted that.
The case goes cold. Then, 4 years after the murder of Eugene Maloff, the investigation is rebooted. Determined to solve the crime, Norwich PD assigned new resources to the case.
They put a task force together, and I was assigned to work with the state's attorney's office along with Detective Terry McFadden.
Detective Curtis and I picked up on the case and basically started from day one.
Cold cases are just cases that take longer to solve than others. It was a fresh start, and it let us get to work on finding out who the real killers were.
We had met with the Malov family and just told them that we were trying to get justice for Eugene, and we were able to secure a reward for information about Mr. Malov's homicide, and that's not typically seen in every homicide.
The reward is advertised on a large billboard near the interstate.
We worked with the family and we came up with the best design possible and put a billboard up where we thought that the most people would see Eugene's face and see our message to the public saying we needed help with this investigation.
After just a few weeks, the billboard starts to bring results.
The day I won't forget in this case is when we had a witness come into the police department and explain to me that they had direct information related to the death of Eugene Malov.
The witness claims to know Candace Foster and Chad Schaefer. Chad is the son of the Andersons, the tenants Eugene evicted.
Jill Sebastian was friends with Candace Foster and Chad Schaefer, and had actually lived with them around that time of Mr. Malov's murder. She began to tell us about how when they would see reports about Mr. Malov's murder on the TV, Chad would start getting kind of antsy. And Candace had mentioned to Jill about Chad coming home with bloody clothing around the time of Mr. Malov's murder.
Investigators are stunned by Jill's statement, but police have no evidence connecting Chad Schaefer to the crime scene.
Early in the investigation, an investigator went to Chad and Candace. They said that on the night of the murder, they had stayed home and there was no evidence to support any connection to Eugene's death.
Police are eager to corroborate Jill's story. Her boyfriend, Keyshawn, agrees to give a statement.
Keyshawn told us that Chad Schaefer confessed to Keyshawn that he had killed Eugene Malov.
Obviously, it's a significant development in the case. We started to look at Candace Foster and Chad more closely.
Police learned that in the years after the murder, Chad and Candace had separated. They focused their attention on Candace.
The number one goal for us was to get information from her regarding Chad, being a participant in the murder of Dr. Eugene Malov.
Police urge Candace to tell them everything she knows.
This is the father of her children that she's now going to be telling us about that participated in a homicide. Candace and Chad had a tumultuous relationship, and she related to us that her biggest fear for her and her children was Chad.
Detectives asked Candace about a piece of physical evidence that could tie Chad to the crime scene.
Candace told us that those keys had been hanging inside the loft at the apartment where Candace and Chad lived, and we happened to find a key ring similar at the crime scene.
The information is damning, but investigators suspect that Candace is hiding something.
Some of the things that Candace had said regarding Chad or regarding her whereabouts on the night of the murder hadn't added up. We had to let Candace know that she would have to come clean and explain to us everything she knew about the murder.
When we interviewed her, a little bit of information would come out, and then a little bit more information would come out. And then it reached a point where Candace did tell us someone other than Chad was involved in Mr. Malov's murder.
Detectives believe Eugene Malov was killed by his former tenant's son, Chad Schaefer. But Chad's ex-girlfriend, Candace, claims Chad wasn't the only one involved in the brutal murder.
Candace told us that Moselle Brown, he had been at the scene with Chad at the time of Mr. Malov's murder. Moselle Brown was the cousin of Chad Schaefer.
Chad had been hanging around with Moselle a little bit more often around this time. Moselle Brown had a violent criminal past. We knew of him. We were cautious of him.
Investigators press Candace for more details about events leading up to Eugene's murder. She says it all started when a relative saw Eugene cleaning out the rental unit the Andersons had been evicted from.
Candace told us that all day long, Chad had been getting phone calls from his mom, Patricia Anderson, saying that the landlord was throwing all their things in the garbage. Patricia was really upset and started putting down pressure on Chad. I told you, you were supposed to get that stuff out of there. You were supposed to have that house cleaned out. I want my belongings. And Chad had gotten picked up by Moselle Brown.
He told Moselle that Mr. Malov was throwing stuff out that belonged to Chad's parents. They get upset.
And they go over there and they say, listen, we're not going to take it from this guy. Mr. Malov says, no, get out of here. I gave you plenty of time to get your stuff out of here. Leave. And someone throws a punch. They hit him once, and now once they hit him, these guys don't stop. They just start beating him. And they leave him for dead.
Following the vicious assault, the pair returned to Chad and Candace's apartment.
Candace told us that they returned. And Chad was upset, and Chad had blood on his clothing. And Chad explained to Candace that they had beaten the landlord.
But Candace's account doesn't explain how Eugene's van ended up in the casino parking lot.
Candace wasn't telling us all this stuff out of the goodness of her heart. She was doing this to minimize her involvement and minimize her punishment.
When investigators confront her about her deception, she finally cracks.
From what Candace was telling us, it looked like three of them were involved. Chad Schaefer, Moselle Brown, and Candace Foster.
Candace says she returned to the rental property with Chad and Moselle to cover up their crime.
Candace said they walked down the path to the garage to where they saw Eugene Malov laying on the ground, and that he was still alive and still breathing, but he was severely beaten. And they realized they gotta kill him.
Candace Foster was a bit reluctant to do that, at which point they threatened her.
Chad and Moselle said if she didn't participate, that she'd be next.
It was a vicious beating with numerous strikes to the face with some unknown object.
And at that point, Eugene's still alive. And that's when Moselle steps on his throat until he stops breathing.
After killing Eugene, Chad, Moselle, and Candace staged the scene to throw police off their trail.
They wanted to make this look like it was a robbery, and part of that was that Candace drove the van and dropped it off in the casino parking lot.
With Candace's story, investigators believe they have enough evidence to charge Chad and Moselle with murder. They arrest Chad Schaefer first.
When the news came through that they actually had an arrest, it was a shock to find out that Gene was killed by a son of a disgruntled tenant. It just seemed unfair.
When investigators track down Moselle Brown, they find out he's serving time in Ohio for another crime.
We extradited him back to Connecticut to face charges for the killing of Eugene Malov. I believe the X factor was Moselle. He was the violent ringleader, and I believe Chad Schaefer and Candace Foster would not have killed Eugene Malov in the absence of Moselle.
The three accused are tried separately.
Moselle received more than 50 years in prison. At Chad's trial, he was defiant and ultimately took a plea deal and took the offer that the state put on the table.
Chad Schaefer agrees to plead guilty to first-degree manslaughter.
Chad Schaefer received a 25-year sentence, and he would have to serve 17 and a half years.
Candace Foster is the last to face justice.
There's no way that we could have had as strong a case that we did against Moselle and Chad without Candace. And Candace, with her attorney, made an arrangement with the state's attorney's office for her to receive the sentence that she got.
Candace eventually was charged with hindering prosecution and tampering with evidence.
She served 3 years in jail and then several years of probation.
The verdicts bring closure, but nothing can replace what Jean's loved ones have lost.
I'm not a good judge as to whether justice was served, but the bottom line was that we couldn't bring back that special, wonderful man.
I think Jean would like to be remembered as somebody that advanced the deeper knowledge of the universe.
I think Gene did make a difference in the world. I think he could have made a much bigger difference had he been around longer.
I just miss Gene, and I really relish all the memories I have of all the happy times. We all loved him so much. The world has lost a great human being, a great mind, and a beautiful person.